Good morning and welcome. In my first Senate speech on Tuesday, the 13th of September, I said, Australians should be able to rely on the information from Australian government bodies and institutions, such as the CSIRO, but we can't. We have had the complete failure of science in policies that has cost Australian taxpayers and citizens and Queensland residents billions of dollars and has cost lives. We have spent $10 billion on desalination plants that have been mothballed based upon a lie that the dams will never fill again. We have spent billions cleaning up after the Brisbane flood that was caused, it seems, by the authorities wanting to overfill the dam to prepare us for the never-ending drought. We are now looking at $400 billion to convert to renewable energy on a whim. And we are seeing the destruction of South Australian economy. We are seeing now other states lining up. We welcome today the world's most eminent climatologist, Canadian Professor Tim Ball. If you come in, Tim. He has a huge story for you all that'll keep you all feeding for years. We also welcome a very devoted scientist and engineer in Tony Heller. He has relentlessly exposed the blatant corruption of temperature data by a handful of staff at NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Technology, Space Studies. And with us in the room is Australian scientist Mr. Peter Bobroff, who is a member of the Order of Australia for services to research. The very first thing I did after being sworn in as a senator was to leave the Senate and go to my office and write a letter to the CSIRO's Chief Executive, Dr. Larry Marshall. I asked him to present the empirical evidence that proves human carbon dioxide is affecting global climate. After pinning him down with the help of two ministers, we had the presentation on the 26th of September. And I would like you to, we have press packs here, we would like you to see the letter that I wrote to him. I want to introduce three phrases. The first phrase is, no danger. Should make everyone happy. No danger. The second one is fabricated data. And the third is groupthink. Now, our findings that I'm going to go through are in response to the CSIRO's document, and this is my response. But you'll see from a link within here that it actually ties to a huge website that comprehensively presents the empirical evidence. Empirical evidence is what decides science. It's the hard data, the physical measurements, the physical observations, the hard facts. And it is linked to this document. And you're welcome to scrutinise it. You'll see that in a little while. Amazingly, I asked the CSIRO's chief climate scientist what in the last 2,000 years, what in the climate record for the last 2,000 years points to imminent danger. They refused to state anything. There is no danger. The empirical evidence shows there is no danger in the climate record. The second thing that we learned was that the CSIRO has no empirical evidence that proves carbon dioxide from our activity affects climate. None. The third is that some of the CSIRO's claims actually contradict empirical evidence. They are unscientific. The onus of proof is on the CSIRO. Minister Hunt, former Minister for Energy and Climate Change, has stated that he relies upon the CSIRO's advice, the Bureau of Meteorology's advice, and advice from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's climate body. Not one of those bodies has any empirical evidence that we are affecting climate. We also learned that the CSIRO has done no due diligence on the data on which it bases its claims. Now that is astounding. We are paying tens of millions of dollars to the CSIRO and they have not done their due diligence. Instead, they rely on corrupted data from the Bureau of Meteorology, corrupted data from NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, where a handful of people dictate what's going on, and the CSIRO relies upon the UN IPCC's corrupted data. And yet this CSIRO's advice is the result, or is the basis for the climate policies of each of our major parties. I want to look at the fabricated data before handing over to Tony. There are places in the Bureau of Meteorology's record where there's no data being taken, no data measurements, and yet they're given measurements. There are places such as Rutherglen in the Bureau of Meteorology's record that the real data shows a cooling trend, and it's been manipulated into a warming trend. So we can, in fact, say that global warming in a computer is man-made. But it's not at Hazelwood Power Station. The Australian temperatures are corrupted. We saw in the records of the Bureau of Meteorology in the 1880s to 1890s, temperatures that were warmer than today, warmer than. And then we've seen a cyclical increase, decrease, increase, decrease, warming, cooling. So what happened after the 1880s and 1890s was it dropped to around the lowest point in the Bureau's records, to 1910. And the Bureau and the CSIRO, when they present us with the temperature data, they omit everything before 1910. So we start from a very low point. Then the temperature increases to the 1930s and 40s. And then it decreases for 40 years. The longest temperature trend in the last 120 years is 40 years of cooling while we were pumping out carbon dioxide around the planet. Carbon dioxide did not cause that cooling. And then it increased slightly. And then we've had 20 years of no temperature rise, despite China and India putting out massive amounts of carbon dioxide. And what's happened is the Bureau has reduced the 1930s temperatures, increased the temperatures during the cooling period, and increased the temperatures later. So instead of seeing this, we see this. I'll now introduce Tony Heller, who will be talking more about the corruption of temperature records.
Great. Thank you, Senator Roberts, and thanks for inviting me. This is my first visit to Australia. I'm having a wonderful time here. It's a great country. I've met wonderful people, beautiful, love the wildlife here. And what Senator Roberts was saying was absolutely correct about the Bureau of Meteorology temperature record. I've looked at it in some detail. And there's fairly good records going back to, say, about the 1850s, 1860s. And what we see is that 1910 was the coolest period in the Australian temperature record, and that's where Bureau of Meteorology starts their graphs. Of course, if you start at the coldest temperature, you're going to see an increase moving forwards to the present. You know, had they created their graph started in, say, 1878 or around there, we would see little or no warming across the Australian temperature record. But what really got me interested in the work that Senator Roberts was doing was the Q&A show with Professor Brian Cox from the BBC presenter. And I saw that, and what Brian Cox did was he held up a graph of NASA temperatures showing temperatures warming, and he sort of implied that this is very bad, and if you don't believe this, you probably don't believe that NASA ever landed a man on the moon either. And that's something I've studied quite a bit, and I was sort of stunned by this because I realized that Professor Cox had probably actually not done any research on this subject at all, or very little, if some, because the actual people who went to the moon, the Apollo astronauts and people associated with it, have been very critical of the NASA climate and temperature programs. In fact, there's only one scientist who's ever set foot on the moon. It's Dr. Harrison Schmitt. He's a Harvard PhD. He was a U.S. senator. He was my senator in New Mexico. And he's been a very outspoken critic of NASA's climate activities. And similarly, there was a group of 49 of NASA's top people from the Apollo program, scientists, engineers, administrators, and astronauts, sent a letter to the NASA administrator several years ago criticizing them for their climate work, saying that they were embarrassing the agency, the work they were doing was substandard, and that they were damaging the good reputation which the Apollo people had created for the agency. So Professor Cox's appeal to authority was very poorly taken. He didn't know, obviously didn't know who the people were who were behind it. And the people who were making these graphs had nothing to do with the Apollo program, and the people in the Apollo program have been very critical of their work. So that's now focusing in on specifically, you probably remember the picture Brian Cox held up, this graph, said, "I brought the graph." He clearly did not know the history of that graph, which is something which I've studied in great detail. If we go back to 1974, graphs look very different. The National Center for Atmospheric and Research in Boulder, Colorado, where I live now, published a graph in 1974. They published a graph showing that there was no global warming from 1870 to 1970. They showed that there was a lot of warming prior to 1940, and then a very strong cooling trend from 1940 to 1970, and all of the previous warming had been lost. In 1975, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences published a very similar graph to that. A lot of warming prior to 1940 and a lot of cooling from 1940 to 1970. And we no longer see that in the NASA temperature graphs. We don't see this 1940 to 1970 cooling anymore. And as late as 1999, NASA still had, they showed no warming from 1870 to 1970. But after the year 2000, NASA started changing their graphs, which is the point that Senator Roberts was originally making with Professor Cox, was that the temperature data has been altered. And you can see it right on the NASA website, and I'll be showing this later in the week. Right on the NASA website, you can look and see in the year 2000, they showed about 0.5 C total warming. In the year 2012, they pushed it up to about 0.9 C warming. Now they show about almost 1.5 C warming over land. And the remarkable thing about this is that this has all occurred since the year 2000. But if we look at actual satellite data, which is much more accurate, much more comprehensive, we see that satellites show that there's been no warming during that period. So NASA has actually tripled the amount of global warming since the year 2000 at a time when satellites show no warming. And this is very troubling because NASA is the U.S. space agency, so why are they ignoring their own satellite data? And I've looked in a great deal of detail at the U.S. temperature record, which is produced by mostly by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. They publish two data sets. One is called the raw data set, which is the actual data which comes off the thermometers they've measured, and another one which is the final data set, which is what they release to the public generally in their graphs. And the raw data, the actual thermometer data, which comes from this incredible network of very good contiguous 1,200 stations in the U.S., shows that the U.S. has been cooling for 80 to 90 years. But the graphs they release to the public show a warming trend, and it's all because they've altered the data. It's all right there on the NOAA website. It's available for anyone to see. But what they don't do is they don't publish graphs of the raw data, and they don't publish disclaimers saying that they have altered the data. So they show these graphs of the U.S. warming tremendous amount, but they don't say with them that this is only due to the fact that they've altered the data. And I would say that this is not how science is done. So what we see is this tremendous manipulation of data of a degree centigrade or possibly even more. And at the same time, NASA comes out and they make statements like, this was the hottest year ever by 0.3 degrees centigrade. But they've altered the data by 1 degree centigrade. So it's pretty meaningless, the kind of things they're saying. And my final comment, I would say, is I've worked on many very mission-critical projects, life and death projects, where everything has to be absolutely right. And I would say, after looking at the NASA data, the way they've worked with the data over the last 10 years, had they been in charge of the Apollo moon mission, that rocket never would have gotten off the ground.
Thank you very much, and I agree. My first visit to Australia, and it's a great honor to be here and to help Malcolm Roberts in exposing what I consider the greatest deception in history. And I don't think that's hyperbole. There have been deceptions, but none on the scale that this has occurred, where it's affected every country, every citizen, and policies are being driven that are detrimental to progress and advance and longer life. So it's a very important issue for me. I've been studying climate for 42 years. When I got into the business, global cooling was the consensus. And I was as opposed to that as I am to the warming, because I knew, looking at the long-term record of climate, that it fluctuates and varies all the time. It's always changing, always has and always will. And I also realized that what was going on was well within natural variability. But of course, the story that was out there was this is unnatural, therefore it must be something that humans are causing. And what happened in the cooling trend was they said, oh, the temperature's going down, oh, and simple linear trend, it'll keep on cooling. But then, of course, it did because it was natural, started to go up again in the 80s, and then the trend was upwards, and everybody got on what I call the trend wagon. The question that should come out of Tony's presentation to you is, why on earth was this manipulation going on? Because one of the things I find when I talk to audiences and explain what is happening, the question immediately is, what's the motive? What is the purpose of this adjustment of the data? And I can tell you how it came about. The whole global warming and climate thing is a subset of the environmental trend that we're in. And environment is very necessary, very good shift, paradigm shift. But certain people grabbed it and saw the political and financial opportunities in it. A group called the Club of Rome, which was formed in Rome in 1968, took the Malthus idea that the world population would outgrow the food supply, and they applied that to all resources. They said the world population would outgrow all of the resources. And they produced a study with simple computer trends called limits to growth. That, by the way, is where the words peak oil came in. Oh, we're going to reach a peak in the amount of oil, and we see how that's been completely destroyed. On the climate side of it, they wanted something that was affecting the whole globe, because they knew that they could not get every nation on Earth to agree on something. So they wanted a threat from space, if you want. The whole world is threatened by global warming. That's why global warming and climate became the vehicle of choice for their political agenda. And the key person in all of this, and in an obscure book, which is very difficult to get now, and I recommend this to you as journalists, because Elaine Dewar was an investigative journalist at the Hamilton Spectator in Canada, and she had a list of all of the environmentalists in Canada and wanted to write a book in praise of what they were doing, saving the planet, doing noble work. The more she did her research, the more she found that they were more corrupt than the people that they were attacking. That people like Elizabeth May, the head of our Green Party, and Maurice Strong in particular. Now, Maurice Strong is a name that you should all become familiar with. He died recently in China, and he was in China because he could not go back to the United States because they wanted him for involvement in the food for oil crisis in Iraq. And what Strong did was, and in the interview with Elaine Dewar, she said, well, what's the problem? And he said, the problem for the planet are the industrialized nations. It's our responsibility to get rid of them. Because they saw that it was the industrialized nation, everybody was using too many resources, but the industrialized nations were using them at an even greater rate. So we had to shut down the industrialized nations. I want you to think about how you would do that. Because one of the things that I've found that's amazing about looking at these people is not only do they have an idea, but they have ways of implementing it. Maurice Strong is one of those people. And so he in response, well, first of all, Elaine Dewar said to him, why don't you run for politics? He said, no, you can't do anything as a politician. She said, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to go to the UN where I can get all the money I want and not be accountable to anybody. He went to the UN, he set up the United Nations Environment Program, out of which came the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That panel was set up deliberately to isolate CO2 as the cause of the problem. Now, how did they do that? Well, I think you have been around long enough to know that when commissions of inquiry are set up, the politicians try to limit them by the terms of reference. I know that. I've been on lots of commissions of inquiry. With the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they were told only to look at human causes of climate change. The problem with that is you can't possibly identify any fraction that might be due to humans if you don't know what the natural variability is and what's causing it. So that was the problem. It focused, of course, it allowed them then to focus on the greenhouse gases. But they only focused on one of the greenhouse gases. They focused on CO2. Why did they focus on, or why didn't they focus on CO2, by the way, is only 4% of the greenhouse gases. How many people know that? They completely ignored 95% of the greenhouse gases, which is water vapor. And they said, oh yeah, humans produce water vapor, but it's such a small amount, it doesn't affect anything. So 95% of the potential greenhouse effect is completely ignored in those IPCC reports. And so you see the problem. Once you set up a lie, And by the way Maurice Strong did it with his organizational skills, the IPCC was a point where people appointed by the World Meteorological Organization, which is made up of every national weather agency around the world. That's why CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology are involved. It's those bureaucrats that are running the show. Strong knew that. He knew that they'd go back and tell their politicians, hey, we got to deal with this global warming issue. It's the end of the world. That's how the whole thing has come about. We're now at the point, of course, where it's falling apart.
Tim's nearly finished. There will be questions.
So, of course, they try to introduce the Kyoto Protocol to punish the developed nations for their use of fossil fuels, take the money for to the developing nations that were suffering a great transfer of wealth. That was exposed when what the scientists were doing was the corrupt science was exposed through the leaked emails from the University of East Anglia. They then replaced the Kyoto Protocol at the Durban Conference with a Green Climate Fund. That was approved recently at Paris and was ratified in the last couple of days, signed into law. That's where we're at now, where we've got global policy based upon completely false, deliberately created science. Because once you start a lie, you either come out and say, I told a lie, or you start admitting the truth. And for bureaucrats, that's a very difficult thing to do.
Thank you. We'll accept questions.
In that case, why are glaciers retreating or melting?
I didn't hear it.
Why are glaciers retreating?
They're not retreating, not all of them. We only monitor about 10% of the world's glaciers, and 50% are advancing and 50% are retreating. The problem by using glaciers is they are more about precipitation than they are about temperature. What causes a glacier to advance or retreat is the amount of snowfall above what's called the Föhn line. So they just cherry-pick glaciers that are retreating and say, oh, here's a glacier that's retreating. I'll tell you the ironic thing, when Cameron was running for office, they flew him to Norway to a glacier, and he stood on there and talked about retreating glaciers. He was on one that was advancing.
But then there must be some change, right? So even if it's precipitation or something else, the change is occurring.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm a geologist, and I've studied glaciers rather extensively. And 20,000 years ago, like we just had the World Series in the United States between Chicago and Cleveland. Both of those cities were under a mile of ice. Glaciers have been retreating steadily for the last 20,000 years. We can look back. When the largest glacier in Alaska, the Muir Glacier, when it was first discovered in the 18th century, extended all the way out to the sea. By the time John Muir, who it's named after, who was the founder of the Sierra Club, saw it in the middle of the 19th century, it had retreated 30 miles. If you look through the literature, we know that glaciers have been retreating for a very long time. The reason that glaciers are retreating... Well, if you look at graphs of sea level rise has been rising steadily for 20,000 years. The first people who came to North America walked across the Bering Strait because there was so much water locked up in ice at that time. Sea level had dropped, 400 feet below what it is now. And they were able to walk across. So we can see from sea level that the glaciers have been melting steadily. And that's what happens because we're in an interglacial period right now. Glaciers will continue to melt until we start back into another ice age. Think of an example of you're sitting there, and you've got a glass at the bar, and you've got ice cubes in the glass. Those ice cubes are melting, right? And they're going to melt until they're gone. Does that indicate that the temperature in the room is increasing? No, of course not. All that it means is that the temperature is above freezing. And that's what an interglacial period is. There's tremendous amounts of records showing that glacier has been melting for hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, 20,000 years they've been melting. So that's not evidence of global warming. All that is evidence of is that the temperature, average temperature in these regions is above freezing as it has been for the last 20,000 years. I have self-funded this, actually. I wanted to come to Australia anyway. I write a blog. A number of people gave small donations to help out, but I'm paying for the trip myself.
And I personally paid for Tim Ball to come down.
And just quickly, Mr. Heller, why have you all done different names, Steve Goddard? And when you
Right. Well, it's very hard to argue against, to debate sort of vague claims like this. I'm perfectly happy to discuss with you at any time any specific claim that's been made that you say has been debunked, and I think I can make a very effective argument.
And he will be here with Professor Ball tomorrow in this same room from 8 o'clock till 10 p.m. to deliver a presentation, slides, all the data you want will be there, and there'll be open question and answers afterwards. This lady has been waiting very patiently.
Senator, what do you hope to do with this report? Do you hope for a Senate inquiry, and do you have any government support for any action on this?
Well, we'll be making sure first of all that the ministers uphold their responsibilities to the Parliament. We'll be holding them accountable to the people of Australia, because in Queensland and all across Australia, we are tired of being ripped off, and that's what's happening. These ministers are either part of the scam or they are complicit by not doing their due diligence. I started that program 9 years ago, and they still have not done their due diligence. I'm helping them to do it. What we'll be doing is making sure that we can help the ministers and the chief executive of the CSIRO fulfil their responsibilities to the Australian population. Well, what I've been doing for the last 8 years, asking for the empirical evidence, and then we'll be taking it a bit further than that. Sure, you... I have never used the word conspiracy. Never. No, the people who are using the word conspiracy, hang on just a minute here. The people who are using the word conspiracy are people like you, and it's quite often used to denigrate because the facts are clear. I have referred to bankers because the bankers are... Hang on, you asked me a question. Do you want me to answer, or are you going to... Would you like to come up and answer your question? Well, I'm trying to. Are you going to be quiet and let me answer? This is a $1 trillion industry we are facing down, my friend. A $1 trillion industry. The major banks themselves have raised that very fact. And by the way, the chief executive of the CSIRO up until 2014 was on the advisory board of the Bank of America Merrill Lynch and the Rothschilds Australia Bank, and they have said that they will be seeking to make trillions of dollars profit from this scam on carbon dioxide trading certificates. Al Gore was a member, his company was one of the members of the Chicago Climate Exchange. Morris Strong, the criminal who died overseas in China, he was a member of the Chicago Climate Exchange. Goldman Sachs was a member of the Chicago Climate Exchange. Barack Obama, through the Joyce Foundation, has connections with that. These are facts. You want to use a C word, you go right for it.
On that though, you did 30 episodes of something called Fair Dinkum Radio. And on one of them, I just want to quote it here, you're on a website called Jew World Order. It's an anti-Semitic website, and you're there on this podcast talking about the same things that you're talking about today. Has this got anything to do with, say, Jewish bankers? Is that what you're alluding to?
I have been very clear about that. Surely, if you've done that research, you would have read my extensive material saying there is no one religion involved. I haven't got nothing against any particular religion in regard to this climate scam at all. I'm working very closely and have worked very closely with prominent members of the Jewish community. Our founders of the Galileo movement actually are very close family links to the Jewish community. Susie Smead, who was one of the founders of the Galileo movement, escaped from the Holocaust camp when she was 2 years of age. And she told me in our first meeting that she's a Hungarian Jew. I love her dearly. I respect and admire the Jews. And for anyone like you to try and insinuate that a scientist and an engineer would want to further take the Jewish people into disregard after hundreds of years of being belted, murdered, and prejudiced is despicable. We are... You can link me to a website all you want, but I have never said anything against any specific religion in regard to this because I've never seen any evidence whatsoever. Is that clear? No evidence whatsoever linking this to any religion.
Again, I just want to follow up with that. First of all, I'm Jewish. And I don't appreciate these sort of insinuations against Senator Roberts. Second of all, about the conspiracy thing, I always hear this thing of You know, how can you take on 5,000, 10,000, however many thousand scientists? Well, the people doing the temperature data, it's just a very small handful of people. And these other 5,000 or 10,000 scientists we hear about all the time, their work, the quality of their work depends on this very small group of people, particularly NASA, NOAA, and a few other groups, on the quality of their work. If the temperature data they're putting out is wrong, that impacts the quality of all of the climate research which derives off that. So that's why it's so terribly important that we look at this seriously. Why are they manipulating the data? Are their manipulations accurate? And how is that affecting the conclusions of this vast body of scientists?
Hang on, someone over here was off.
Just on another matter, has the One Nation Party had a meeting this morning regarding non-partisan, and do you believe that he should remain in Parliament?
We have had a meeting this morning, I can confirm that. We personally support Rod, and we always have through this. He's going through a very difficult time emotionally and mentally. It's a very difficult time. We recognise that and are personally supporting him. It would not be appropriate for me to comment on the specifics of the situation right now. It's part of the High Court process, or will be, and Pauline Hanson, our party's leader, will be making a statement in the Senate this morning. Well, I'd like to get the facts first because I don't know about them. So that's something that's probably something that'll have to come out in the near future.
We're not on the subject of non-partisan. We have different agendas.
Well, you can ask any questions you want to, but we are here talking about one of the world's biggest ever scams that is costing, hang on just a minute, that is costing Queenslanders and Australians billions of dollars. Billions of dollars. Thank you very much for your attention this morning.
That's about what he